Good morning, everyone. This is Father Nate, missionary priest in Italy, and thanks for joining us today, March 10th, on No Greater Delight, our podcast on Marian feasts and Marian meditations. Well, today, as always, we have a number of feasts. So we have one in Italy, actually two in Italy, I think, here, and then another one in France. So without further ado, let's get started with Our Lady of the Vine in Tuscany, Italy. So this is what Father Orsini says. He says, Our Lady of the Vine in Tuscany, Italy, a fine church located near Viterbo, occupied at present by the Dominicans. Okay, so this is a little bit difficult because there's no date mentioned. And likewise, Viterbo has, the city itself is at the foot of the mountain Cimino in the province of Rome. But there's a lot of religious houses, a lot of convents there, and there doesn't seem to be any reference to Our Lady of the Vine, right? Anywhere, even in the entire region of Tuscany. There's two references to Dominican convents, though, that we can find. And one is Our Lady of the Oak, or Madonna de la Quercia, which is, it also has a Dominican convent attached. The other one is Santa Maria dei Gradi, of which there's only the church at present. So, we assume, because it's probably, according to my source here, it's most likely the source is that Our Lady of the Oak is what Father or Abbot Orsini refers to as Our Lady of the Vine, which would be appropriate. It's a very fascinating story. So, at one time in the town of Viterbo, there was a man named Mastro Battiste Magnano Iuzzante, who was a very devoted follower of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So he hired a painter in the year 1417 to paint an image on a tile of Mary, holding the child Jesus in her arms. So then, once the tile was finished, he placed it on an oak tree near the edge of his vineyard, which was on the road leading to Bagnania, and which robbers, unfortunately, often awaited to attack travelers. Now, the image remained there for about 50 years, and after a while, very few people ever went to go pray at it, right? Although it was very beautiful because the tree had started to, grow around it, right? And so much so that a wild vine also had embraced the oak, right? So it was a very sort of nice setting there. Now, during this period, a hermit from Siena, a Pier Domenico Alberti, whose hermitage was at the foot of the Palanzana, went around the countryside and the towns near Viterbo, saying, among Bagnania and Viterbo there is a treasure, right? Between those two towns, there's a treasure. So actually a lot of people who were very greedy started digging around and looking for this treasure, but they didn't find anything. So of course they went back to the hermit and said, well, what do you mean? And he brought them then to the oak tree and pointed to them the real treasure, Our Lady, right? And then he confessed that, one time he wanted to take the sacred image away to his hermitage, but it miraculously returned back to the oak. Now, interestingly enough, this wasn't the first instance of that. There was a woman called Bartolomea, who also decided, because she would walk by the tree, she would pray every time she saw the image, and one time she just decided to take the tile home with her. So she said her prayers at home, she went to bed, but then the next morning she woke up and the image was gone. So she ran to the oak tree, and guess what? That's where it was found, returned in its place. She tried the same thing again, and yet again the image returned to the tree. So she decided not to say anything, because people would think she was crazy. But then in 1467, during the month of August, there was a huge plague that spread the entire region, right? So some of these people in the town who were very worried remembered that image painted on the tile, and they went out there in droves to pray beneath the oak tree, right? A local historian says that one day alone there were 30,000 people who went there, right? Well, a few days later, the plague stopped. And then 40,000 of the faithful came back to thank Our Lady, right? So in early September of that same year, another event happened. There was a good knight of Viterbo who had, unfortunately, many enemies. So he was surprised by his enemies one day outside of the city of Viterbo. He was alone and unarmed, so he didn't know what to do. He ran into the woods. When he was exhausted and he was hearing the cries of his enemies drawing closer and closer, he reached the oak tree with the sacred image of Our Lady. And he fell at her feet with great faith and embraced the trunk of the tree. So the knight's enemies reached the oak, but were surprised that they could no longer see him. They began to look everywhere, behind every tree and bush, but nobody could see him because he had disappeared before their very eyes. Finally, when they realized that they weren't going to find him, they just gave up. So the knight, after thanking the Blessed Mother, returned to Viterbo and told everybody what happened. And that's when Bartolomeo let it spill, like that she had also taken it, and there were the tile, and there were miracles, right? As a result, many people started coming to honor our Blessed Mother and to implore her help at that tree, right? So then they built an altar, and then finally a little chapel. And Paul II gave permission to build a small church there in 1467. Interestingly enough, we're told that many popes and saints have been devoted to this image, including St. Charles Borromeo, St. Paul of the Cross, St. Ignatius of Loyola, St. Crispin of Viterbo, and even St. Maximilian Kolbe. On January 20th, 1944, during the bombing of Viterbo, there was a group of bombers who were headed straight for the oak, like they were going to destroy it, but miraculously, inexplicably, they veered from their course, and the bombs dropped, didn't destroy anything there. In 1986, Pope St. John Paul II proclaimed Our Lady of the Oak patroness of the new diocese of Viterbo, which was formed from the old diocese of Viterbo, Tuscania, Montefiascone, Acquapendente, and Bagno Reggio. Right? So that's very, very beautiful. Likewise, that's the story of Our Lady of the Oak or Our Lady of the Vine. Like we said, Abbot Orsini calls it Our Lady of the Vine, but there's an oak tree with an image in it, which is wrapped around in a vine, so that's explicable. Also, we celebrate today Madonna dei Miracoli in Andria in Bari. She is considered the patroness of the city and of the diocese. It's a very old image of Our Lady in a fresco that's found above the vault of the crypt of the upper church, and many miracles have been attributed to her. In fact, I have a note here that says there was an apparition in 1576, but there's not any further information. And then last but not least, we have Notre Dame de Pradelles in Haute-Loire, Auvergne-Rhône Alps in France. So devotion to Our Lady of Pradelles began in 1512 with this discovery of her statue in the soil of a field by the hospital, where the chapel bell tower now stands. But the event that really brought her fame took place on March 10th, today, 1588, when there were the wars of different religions, right? You have the Catholic faith and the Protestants. So, having wreaked havoc in the region for some time, Huguenot troops began to attack Pradelles, or they wanted to, right? But they were defeated, and the town was spared pillage. So, the inhabitants attributed their victory to Mary's protection, right? In 1793, unfortunately, revolutionaries threw the statue in the fire, but somebody pulled it out half burned. The statue was then restored with local pine, returned to the chapel, and solemnly crowned on July 18th, 1869. There's an annual pilgrimage which takes place on the Feast of the Assumption, which is August 15th. And so that is what's happening today, March 10th, in the Marian world. For today's reading from the Imitation of Mary by Alexander de Rouville, we continue Book 3, which examines Mary's virtues after Jesus' death until his ascension. And today we'll consider Chapter 11. Consolation follows trials, but we must learn to suffer without consolation. And this is a conversation between Mary and the believer. And we start off with the believer. Queen of heaven, rejoice, for the Son who you bore in your womb, and whose death caused you so much grief, has risen as he promised. You enjoyed peace and intimate converse with him until the day of his ascension into heaven. It was only right that you, more than anyone else, should share the blessings of his resurrection, for you, more than anyone else, share his suffering and shame. What joy and indescribable contentment you experienced in beholding his full splendor and glory. Now indeed your tears were dried, the deep wound in your heart was healed, and your sufferings were over. Mary. My child, God is with his friends in their trials. That's Psalm 91, verse 15. To strengthen them with his grace, and, when it pleases him, to make consolation follow on suffering, sweetness on bitterness. David had this experience. When cares abound within me, your comfort gladdens my soul. That's Psalm 94, verse 19. The Lord at times lets the just man be afflicted, but then he restores his tranquility. The believer. Holy Virgin, you know the trials that have long afflicted me. I am continually deprived of all consolation. Mary. My child, if you have no sensible consolations, then acquire those of the Spirit. Is it not a wonderful consolation to realize that trials make you like Jesus and put you on the path to heaven? And God has his reasons when he allows his servants to suffer and does not give them the consolation of which you speak. There have been many saints who have had to cross arid deserts and never taste a single drop of that dew. The friends of Jesus should not be like earthly friends, who are not willing to endure anything for their friends unless they hope to be quickly recompensed. Trust yourself entirely to providence. Then, when consolations become necessary or useful, you will be given them. In your afflictions, you have the grace of Jesus to sustain you. My grace is enough for you, 2 Corinthians 12:9. The saints whom Jesus allowed to suffer without sensible consolations found their consolation in the fact of having none, for they realized that their love was becoming nobler and purer. Wait a while longer. Wait for the promises of Jesus to those who suffer to be fulfilled. He is already making ready for you in heaven an abundance of delights and blessings. Enter into yourself. Look into your own conscience and consider whether your sins have not deserved the deprivation of all consolation. For a repentant sinner, it ought to be a genuine consolation to think that by suffering without consolation, he is more surely expiating his sins.
Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed our Marian podcast. As St. John Paul II teaches us, from Mary we learn to love Christ, her Son, the Son of God. Through her intercession, may we grow ever closer to him. We encourage you to share this with a loved one or friend and help spread our devotion to Mary. Thank you, and God bless.